Good morning, brothers and sisters in Christ. In this second week of celebration of the resurrection of Jesus, we celebrate for 50 days the resurrection of Christ. And 40 days his resurrection, and 10 days his ascension for Pentecost. And this morning we're beginning in our morning prayer lessons to look at the book of Deuteronomy. We were looking at the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, a bit of Numbers during Lent, and now because we're coming into this new time in the church's year, we are thinking about the people of Israel on the border of the Jordan River, ready to go into the Promised Land, and Moses is going to give them some directions about that, and that's what Deuteronomy is. It's his speech to them before he dies on the plains of Moab, getting ready to enter into the Promised Land over the Jordan River. And in the New Testament lessons, we're kind of paralleling this with the book of Acts, reading through it, which is something very ancient done in the early church. Reading the book of Acts as a post-Easter thing, the birth of the church and this new life in Christ, and how that works itself out in the early church. So it's a wonderful parallel between Deuteronomy and Acts, we're reading each day. The word Deuteronomy, the name of the text, comes from the Greek Septuagesima. This was a translation of the Old Testament into Greek in the centuries just before Christ. And deutero means second in Greek, so the second law. So the first being that which was given on Mount Horeb by God to Moses, and this is now on the plains of Moab. It's Israel's final words to Israel before entering into the Promised Land. And it's summarized by the great commandment in Deuteronomy 6:5, to love God with all your heart and your strength. There is also in it, as well as all of these laws about how to follow God, 10 commandments restated, other commandments. There's also this call to centralize their worship in Jerusalem. Remember, now they've been living a nomadic life, and now they're going to enter into this Promised Land, and there's a way in which they're going to stay united, or hopefully stay united, through worshipping centrally in Jerusalem. There's an emphasis on rewards and punishments, blessings and curses for obedience or disobedience to the law. As long as you do the right things, all will be well. If you do the wrong things, that's you're going to experience punishment for it. And that's true in one sense. There can be this sort of strict correlation between our suffering and our disobedience. Is later there's a kind of a further reflection on that in the wisdom literature that we see, where, for example, Job is not suffering because he's a righteous man, but just because of the nature of this test of Satan. And we see it in other works that suffering can not be necessarily the result of our own disobedience. We're in a fallen world. In fact, we see that most clearly in Christ, who's the perfect man and suffers terribly. This book of Deuteronomy is been described as more warm-hearted, a kind of more personal style of Moses speaking to the people than in the earlier texts that we read. Moses is preparing them to change from that nomadic life into community life. And the next book in the Bible, in the Old Testament, Joshua, is the one who actually brings them across the Jordan and into that Promised Land. So something to reflect on for today's readings. One is, profound change is about to happen to the people. And in the same way, the move from bondage in Egypt to this freedom and liberty that they had while they were wandering through the wilderness. Now there's going to be a second kind of powerful change in their lives from nomadic life, from wandering, to which they become accustomed, to now being sedentary in the promised land. Of course, it's going to also be a battle when they enter into that, before they attain that. But this is interesting. In verse 6 of today's reading, the Lord our God said to us on Horeb, "You have stayed long enough at this mountain. Turn and take your journey, and go to the hill country of the Amorites, and to all their neighbors in the Arabah, in the hill country, and in the lowlands, and in the Negeb, and by the sea coast, the land of the Canaanites, and Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. See, I have set the land before you. Go in and take possession of the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give to them, to their offspring after them." And we can think about this as, again, that they have to have a change of mind, that we can get used to a particular pattern, and that seems like home, but it's not. And God is continually calling us to, at every stage in our lives, to think about, well, what about now? What is this stage? What am I now being called to? Can I just rest in sit on our laurels and rest? Or is there something we're being pushed to move to next? And are we ready for God when God calls us for a change of life? Where we live, our work, whatever. Are we ready, always listening and attentive to hear Him? Where is He calling us to now? Can we, as a church, discern now where it is we're being called to, particularly at this time? It's not going to be the same. But we're always being challenged a bit to move. And secondly, they're being called to move from a life of wandering, which they become used to, and then into the promised land, into kind of attainment of their expectations, this new land that's going to be flowing with milk and honey. We can think of that as the call of each one of us to enter into the risen and resurrection life of Christ, the promised land. If we've given up something which was important to us before, but which was destructive, now we're entering into a kind of peace, can we dwell in that life of holiness, in that joy in the Spirit, in peace with God and with others? Or is there a part of us that's going to be struggling for more attention, more opposition, or just isn't comfortable with holiness? Can we stay in that place of dwelling with new spiritual joys? That's a tension in our lives, and we're called to have a certain discipline to stay with it, to receive those joys, receive that peace. And just one further thing about entering into the promised land. The mystics have always seen the new life in Christ to have a certain another dimension to it. There's of course, the outward active life in which we enter into kind of following the life of Christ, following His steps, His acts of love towards our neighbor, forgiving our enemies, loving them. But then there's also this, and so there's kind of the manifestation of the promised land in our community by love. But then there's also the entering into our hearts inwardly to discover and a promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, our heart of hearts, the place above which God is known, where we can have conversation with Him. So if you can think about the difficulty of going into a room by ourselves to close the door and to be quiet, to be still before God, how that's so difficult to do. It's perhaps one of the hardest things on earth, even harder than conquering kingdoms. It's harder to conquer our own soul and to be able to rest in it, to be comfortable in our own skin through the cross of Christ, to rest there and to wait upon God and for a word from him. So we can think about that other entering into God's rest as an entrance into the life of contemplation. I wish you a blessed and glorious day with this sunshine and this very beautiful spring day.